Hi, welcome everybody. Um, Thank you so much for joining us today at this event, which is being convened by the Chicago Center on Democracy and the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago. My name is Renata Segura. I'm the Deputy Director for Latin America at the International Crisis Group, and I'm very grateful to Kevin and his colleagues for having invited me to moderate this panel today, in which we have a great group of people to discuss the current crisis in Venezuela. We have Armando Armas, who is a member of the Venezuelan Parliament and a current student, a graduate student at the University of Chicago. We have Dorothy Kronick, a professor at UPenn, Javier Corrales, who teaches at Amherst, and Michael Albertus, who's also at the University of Chicago. So just a word on how we're going to proceed. I'm going to ask a question to each of the panelists for hopefully very brief answers. Ideally not more than 5 minutes, and I'll try to be very strict about the timing so we have a good chance for conversation. We'll do a couple of rounds and then we'll open the conversation to the other participants that are joining us this morning. If you want to have a comment or a question, there's two ways to do it. If you see on your Zoom, there's a chat which we can all see. So you can just type that there, or there's also a reaction button on the right where you can raise your hand, and at the right time I'll call you on, and Kevin will unmute you, and you will be able to participate in person if you prefer to do that. Otherwise, I'll just read aloud the questions. So because the time is short and we could be talking about Venezuela for a good long week, given everything that's been happening there, why don't we just jump on? So I thought that the first set of questions should maybe address the two interconnected crises that are affecting Venezuela right now. The political one, which has resulted in the country essentially becoming a one-party state, and the economic one, which has triggered one of the most serious humanitarian crises in the region and a wave of refugees that is really unprecedented for Latin America. So I want to ask my panelists a couple of questions about how we came to the point where we are today in 2021. So why don't we start with Armando? Armando, you've said in the past that Venezuela went from being a democracy to becoming an authoritarian regime that has become, essentially that has seen the rise of a mafia state. Could you explain us why you're saying that?
Well, just a brief comment before jumping to this question. I think the Venezuelan, many observers would say that the Venezuelan crisis is just one, which is a man-made and political crisis, and the economic crisis is just an outcome, a deliberate outcome of this main crisis. Having said that, well, there's no easy answer to this. The mafia state or criminal state is not a concept of mine. It's actually, it was pointed out by this organization named Inside Crime. And there are at least 7 reasons to label Maduro regime as such. So number one is the level of criminal penetration into the institutions, the evidence of kleptocracy, and if I have time, I would like to talk about this further on, especially about something called strategic corruption, if we have time, of course. Then the devolution of state powers to irregular and illegal actors, which I know Dorothy have plenty of work on that, and exponential growth of Venezuelan organized crime, high levels of violence by state and non-state actors, as we're seeing in Apure state right now, in the border with Colombia, high levels of violence by state and the exportation of criminality and widespread international accusations of criminal behavior. So, but the mafia state concept is not the most important one in order to characterize the regime, I think. So authors recently, like Alberto Rey, have labeled the system as a liquid totalitarian system, which is a non-hierarchical, network-based, highly adaptive type of system, which only objective is to remain in power at any cost. So that's their aim and their main objective. So practices is just criminal practices are just rational choices for them, especially if those practices are backed by their international allies like Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and Cuba, of course, not to name others in the Caribbean. Venezuela has been a place for the testing of all of these sort of maneuvers against democratic governance. It is a kind of perverse social experiment that has allowed tyrannies worldwide to gain experience on how to cling into power in the era of the internet. And we have seen, I think this week, 2 days ago, Adrian Arsh, Latin America Center for Latin America of the Atlantic Council has released this extensive report on digital autocracies with Maduro's case. So Venezuela is one of the clearest examples of how states and non-state actors occupy a country. And by occupation, I'm not only referring in the traditional sense of the concept. It's just, we know that the cyberspace is just another domain of warfare and sovereignty. And yeah, this is the type of challenges that we are facing. I mean, there are books like La Invasión Consentida, the consented invasion by aka Diego Maldonado. You can find it on Amazon, on how this perverse strategy, starting in 1959, actually, by Fidel Castro. When Castro entered triumphant in Havana in 1959, in January 1959, only 3 weeks after, he flew to Caracas to have this meeting with Rómulo Betancourt, asking to finance his continental revolution with Venezuelan oil. And Rómulo Betancourt said, if you want oil, you have to pay for the oil. And by the way, you should get your democratic elections done in Havana as soon as possible. So he didn't like that. And for over 4 decades, he tried to penetrate, infiltrate the system. He partnered up with Venezuelan socialist revolutionaries, and especially one group called La Liga Socialista, the Socialist League, which the Secretary General was killed, presumably because he was behind the kidnapping of an American citizen. They paid $20 million for the ransom, and they kidnapped the brains behind this operation. And I can say this because my substitute in Parliament, the member of Parliament, which is my substitute, he wrote the book, and he earned the National Press Conference, the Venezuelan Press Conference Prize back in the day. So I spoke with him 2 days ago. The name of the Secretary General was Jorge Rodriguez, father, which is the father of Delcy Rodriguez and Jorge Rodriguez, which have been they have been holding preponderant posts all along this 20 years of Bolivarian revolution. So, and Nicolás Maduro belonged to this Socialist League as well. He went trained to Havana in the early 80s. So the whole picture of how the Venezuelan opposition or the Venezuelan political and economic elites went corrupt during the 40 years, and that's why Chavez arose into power, I think it's just part of the story, not the whole part of it, not the whole of it.
Thanks.
There's a lot of things to talk about.
I understand it's a big topic, and maybe we can get in a little bit of the weeds later on the Q&A. But why don't we turn to Javier now? Javier, you've written about Venezuela's democratic backsliding, but you've also looked at these phenomena elsewhere in Latin America and in the region. Could you tell us a little bit how you see Venezuela compared to other countries in this sense?
So when the process of democratic backsliding began in Venezuela, with a little bit before Hugo Chavez, but very quickly under Chavez, the case became archetypal. In other words, a lot of what Chavez did has been replicated since then or even before. In other words, you have executive aggrandizement, this together with some kind of social policy or delivering some things that the majorities like. And for a while, it followed a playbook. But the Venezuelan process has two elements that are not distinctive, but very special. First, there have been very few cases that start the process of backsliding at such a high point of democracy. That doesn't mean that Venezuela was a remarkable democracy, but normally we see backsliding go this far in countries that were not as democratic as Venezuela was. So the starting point was different. And of course, the end point. Very few cases cross to this sort of like other side of authoritarianism. In the Americas, we've only seen it in Nicaragua to go this far. Now, that doesn't mean that the other cases haven't come close. So in terms of starting point and distance travel, how far the regime has become incredibly closed, restrictive, repressive, and unpluralistic, it's almost without precedent in the third wave of democratization.
Thanks, Javier. Very, very worth that. I guess let's turn now to Dorothy and the question of how these political crises, as Armando was saying, is fairly interconnected with the economic one, and perhaps dividing it as two it's a little bit fictitious. But this economic decline in Venezuela has crippled what used to be one of the most prosperous countries in the continent, and now obviously facing a terrible debacle. What happened? What went wrong?
Renata, I think the thing to understand about the Venezuelan economic crisis is that it's actually three crises in one. And any one of them alone would have been pretty bad, but together they've produced the biggest economic contraction in recorded Latin American history, right? So the first of those three, and I argue the most important, is really terrible macroeconomic policies chosen by Chavez and Maduro. So Chavez was in office from 1999 to 2013 and enjoyed the largest windfall, the huge oil boom, and basically squandered that money. Okay, so instead of saving and investing, Chavez spent that money on consumption. Some of it popular consumption, to be sure, but a lot of it was actually elite consumption, right? Money going into the pockets of cronies and to the more privileged classes. And alongside squandering the oil boom, Chavez and then later Maduro also destroyed technical capacity of Venezuela's oil company, PDVSA, so that oil production, and oil, of course, being the main source of export revenue and a huge part of GDP, was declining rather than increasing. Now, you might think that this kind of spending the oil boom is typical of oil states, that we can't really blame Chavez because everyone overseeing a commodity boom like this would overspend. And I really want to emphasize that is not the case. Okay, so that may have been the narrative in the 70s when it's true, many OPEC countries overspent, went into debt, and other countries in Latin America as well, and then experienced a big crash. But by the commodity boom of 2003, 4, through 2010, that is, Chavez's period, a lot of other countries had learned, and they learned from the experience from the 70s and had saved and established vehicles for kind of saving some of those oil funds in a rainy day fund and being prepared for the crash. And Chavez in this period is an outlier in terms of not doing that. And Renata, I just want to emphasize, when I say countries had learned, I don't just mean Norway. Okay, even countries like Bolivia under Evo Morales, an ideological ally of Chavez, who similarly had a lot of similar authoritarian tendencies, had much more responsible macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy. So I agree we can't divorce these two, and at the same time, they're not necessarily related, right? I think if we look at the case of Evo Morales, we see a really important contrast. Okay, so that bad policy, I would say, was crisis number one, and that was bad enough on its own. But then crisis number two is in 2014, oil prices crash. So after 2013, oil prices go from $95 a barrel to $32 a barrel a few years later. This is a huge negative external shock. And this is the kind of thing that would be tough for a country to cope with, even under the best of circumstances. And of course, the economic management of Chavez and Maduro is far from the best of circumstances. I think we have to look here not just at Chavez's policies, but also at Maduro, who responded to this negative economic shock by slashing imports and consumption, and while maintaining kind of some transfers to cronies and a really Byzantine model of price controls and currency controls and misplaced subsidies. So, Maduro did a really bad job managing the crisis, even conditional on what Chavez handed him. And this produced what I would call this combination of mismanagement and oil shock, a classic 80s crisis. And you see Venezuela suffering something that every other country in the region learned to avoid, hyperinflation. Okay, so this is kind of a retro problem. Now, this is everything I've said so far is basically before 2016, 2017. Things are bad enough, right? You have this terrible macroeconomic management, this huge negative, external shock from oil prices. And then you have the third part of this crisis, which is sanctions from the Trump administration. I think we're going to talk about sanctions later, so I don't want to go into detail, but let's just say these economic sanctions were designed to starve Venezuela of cash, and they were very successful, and the economy really suffered. So I think, these are these three strikes, right? One, terrible macroeconomic management. Two, a huge negative shock in terms of a drop in oil prices, and then sanctions on top of that. These three things combined forces to create one of the worst economic and humanitarian catastrophes that the region has ever seen.
Thanks, Dorothy. I'm sorry, a moment for a technical thing. I think Kevin is gonna mute us all, and then he'll unmute us by one, because I think we're getting a lot of echo from.
Or we can just put on headphones if that's a problem, Kevin.
Yeah, but I think we're gonna. Okay, let's see if maybe Armando muting helped. So I'm gonna turn to Mike now, because a lot of your work, Mike, has actually addressed the question of how the economic crisis and the political crisis sort of overlap. And you've stated that Venezuela is a particularly interesting case in that the democratic decline started in economic boom times, but it has accelerated during the bust. So why don't you explain to us a little bit how you see these two aspects of the crisis connecting with each other?
Sure, yeah, and thanks again. I think this is a really important discussion to have, and thanks for moderating, Renata. I think there's one important thing that connects the boom times and the bust times, and that is authoritarianism. That's really the common underlying thread throughout this entire period. And so, let's talk first a little bit about the boom times, right? So we typically think that democracy dies in periods of crisis, right? In periods, particular things like economic crises. Economic crises tend to be harder for regimes in general to handle. And so it's very rare for democracies in particular to crumble and to backslide during times of economic growth. But that's exactly what happened in the case of Venezuela. As Dorothy previously mentioned, Chavez rode this enormous commodity boom in the 2000s throughout the entire decade, really. And in particular for Venezuela, oil was obviously really a critical factor here. And, the regime funneled a lot of that money into all kinds of different programs. So Dorothy mentioned that, elites also lined some of their own pockets. And I think that that's true, but it's also the case that that they created this enormous network of social programs, things known as misiones. And those programs were actually fairly effective in reducing poverty and inequality, simply due to the fact of the consequence of the enormous amount of money that the government funneled into these programs, right? However, the programs were not, clean, if you will, or so to speak. They were heavily politicized, and they were targeted at very specific individuals, right? And so they were used to churn out votes for the regime, and they were used to sort of threaten people who were considering voting against the regime, right? And so these things were, the programs, as well as many other things, were part of, what was known as ventajismo in Venezuela, right? So the use basically of the state apparatus to try and tilt the electoral playing field in its advantage. So that's sort of the boom times. So in particular, the Chavez government was using state largesse to try and consolidate its power. That accelerated when the bust happened. So as Dorothy mentioned, in the early 2010s, the commodity boom came to an end, right? And the price of oil really cratered. That happened right around the time when Chavez died and Maduro took over. So, for any president, I think, or any leader, it would have been a difficult thing to manage, right? But for in the particular position that Maduro stepped into, was very difficult, right? So he stepped into a position in which the state was basically funding. He had enormous outlays, social outlays, in order to try and bolster support for the regime. And he couldn't any longer rely on state largesse to churn out these votes. And so as a result, Maduro had to really rely on other tactics. So he started to use, to a much greater degree than Chavez had used, state repression, stealing votes more directly, stacking the electoral commission, although that was something that built on what Chavez had previously done, disbanding the legislature by doing sort of an end run, convoking a constituent assembly, as well as a host of other political tactics. And as a result, all major opposition is sort of stamped out now in Venezuela. And when groups organize and push against the regime is very savvy in trying to silence those voices. And so, it's much to the credit of the opposition that there's really continued effort to do that. And there have been certain successes, but the biggest success in terms of unseating the regime obviously has not been achieved.
Thanks, Mike, and I think you leave us at a very good place to transition from this more historical perspective and how we got to where we are right now to the current situation, right? Because after the December elections, essentially Maduro has a tight control of all the branches of government. The opposition is very divided. The U.S. maximum pressure strategy seems to have failed. That is the one that the Grupo de Lima and others have been supporting until now. So it would be interesting to get your expertise on what is happening right now and where are things likely to go in the future. So maybe we can start with Javier. So I guess Dorothy and I were just talking before we started about an op-ed that she published in the New York Times in 2019, which started with the sentence, Nicolás Maduro has a knack for defying prophecies of his demise. And certainly that is the case. And Javier, you have written about function fusion as perhaps one of the key reasons that has allowed him to defy all of these prophecies. Why don't you explain us what that concept means and how has that worked in helping Chavismo remain in power?
Me first, or Dorothy, or?
No, for you, sorry.
Oh.
I think it would be very interesting if we can look at function fusion as sort of that explaining variable for how they've been able to survive.
Right, so the puzzle, to go back to Mike's and Dorothy's point, is, even authoritarian regimes confronting such a massive blow to their economy, this is a stressful situation, and many survive it and others don't, and Maduro survived it. And I was trying to say, how did the government manage to survive this when, as Mike was saying, its traditional mechanisms were no longer available? So one of the things that I argue is that it relies on traditional autocratic practices. They're there. Your basic use of repression, your basic use of going against leaders of the opposition, attacking the press, but also some innovation. And this is what I mean by function fusion. What Maduro has started to do is to take organizations that are created with particular function, but giving them multiple functions that are semi-state-like and also semi-delinquent type, to borrow from Armando. So take, for example, the way that the government represses. There is an official coercive apparatus. There are multiple organisms within there, but the reliance of paramilitaries and civic groups and colectivos, for example, and granting them the opportunity to repress almost with impunity. But then these military actors are given the ability to conduct businesses as well, to behave as dealers in the economic crisis, to profit from the repression that they do and become almost like local sheriffs. So there you have a multitude of opportunities. Many of them are also providing social assistance, sometimes the very same people that are repressing you as civilians and are engaging in economic illicit economic activities are sometimes also providing social services, like driving people around to whatever they may need. And I wrote about how this has been done throughout a number of organizations. We saw it, for example, with judges as well. Judges now are not only deciding cases, but they're also running businesses. They're also participating in political primaries, etc. And I advance that argument as a way to say how essentially the regime is able to perhaps hide some responsibility for its dirty tricks, but also allowing different groups to have different stakes in the system, and therefore create a larger constituency of support, even as the system as a whole is crumbling. But I hope that's clear, and I hope students of authoritarianism engage in conversations about how frequently they see this type of rule propagate in other authoritarian settings.
Right. Thank you, Javier. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And a little bit, let's say, related to the question of how the system has been tried to be dismantled from outside, or at least pressured in some way, is the question of sanctions that Dorothy was referring to recently. And as everybody know, wide sectors of the opposition have aligned themselves with what the Trump administration called a strategy for maximum pressure, and they have pressed for economic sanctions against the regime. But many observers have pointed out that these have seemed to be ineffective, really, in moving Maduro or breaking the political crisis, and in fact have been really hurting the population, limiting access to food and medical services, particularly now during the pandemic. So, Dorothy, why don't you explain to us a little bit of where we are on the sanctions? What are they? How have they affected both the politics and the economy of Venezuela? And how can we see this moving forward with the Biden administration? I know it's not been too long, and there's been not many signs of change, but what do you think is coming in that sense?
Sure. So first, I guess, what are sanctions and how have they affected the Venezuelan economy? Sanctions actually began under Obama, who imposed some very limited targeted sanctions on specific officials in Venezuela involved in repressing the 2014 protests. But the use of sanctions really ramped up in the Trump administration. Trump imposed more targeted sanctions on individual officials in the Venezuelan government, but more importantly, in August of 2017, imposed financial sanctions, barring the purchase of new debt from the Venezuelan government or from PDVSA, or even of previously issued debt. So the idea of these financial sanctions in 2017 was to cut off the Venezuelan government and the state oil company from international financial markets, which you can imagine is very detrimental. There were some other executive orders in 2018, but then the next kind of big change in the sanctions regime is in January 2019, when the United States prohibits anyone, U.S. actors, from doing business with the Venezuelan government or with the Venezuelan oil company, essentially stopping the purchase of Venezuelan oil. And the United States, of course, for a long time has been a major purchaser of Venezuelan oil. In addition, later in 2019, summer 2019, the Trump administration started pursuing kind of secondary sanctions or punishments for companies or entities outside the United States who were doing business with Venezuela, who were doing business with the Venezuelan government. And so that was extremely detrimental as well. Now, it stands to reason that when you try to stop a country from selling the commodity that accounts for 95% of its export revenue, it's going to hurt the economy. And I think that was the intent, and the economy has suffered. We see an acceleration of some of these negative economic trends that were in place before sanctions. I think there has been some kind of debate or discussion about, did sanctions make things worse? To me, it's very clear that they did. Venezuelan economist Francisco Rodriguez has done some, I think, careful work on this, looking for empirical evidence of the effect of sanctions. And you do see that. And indeed, that was the intent, right, to make things harder for the regime. But as the other panelists have discussed, those sanctions have also had these major humanitarian impacts. one of the biggest humanitarian crises and increase in poverty and hunger that we've seen in the region. From Biden, we are going to see, and I think what we've seen so far is a continuation, certainly, of a lot of the same rhetoric that we saw under Trump, a really tough line on Maduro. Biden and a continuation of sanctions. I should also say, recognizing Guaido as the president of the country in January 2019 is not a sanction, but it had huge economic impacts in that it prevented Maduro from accessing funds that are in accounts outside the country and gave control of those funds to Guaido. So that was also, a major kind of Trump policy that had big economic impacts that was not itself a sanction. What I see from Biden so far is what I would call a more practical approach in terms of acknowledging the unfortunate reality that Nicolás Maduro remains the de facto president of Venezuela. I don't think Biden is happy about that. I don't think they want that to continue, but that is nevertheless the reality. And so just to give two quick examples of that kind of practical approach. So recently, there was an agreement between Maduro and Guaido to try to bring vaccines into the country, where Guaido was going to use some funds and Maduro was going to allow the distribution of COVID vaccines within Venezuela. And you see US government officials, in particular Jim Story, the ambassador, congratulating them on that agreement. This deal now may be partially scuttled because Maduro, for political reasons, has said that he won't take that, they won't bring AstraZeneca into Venezuela. But this kind of language of I congratulate Maduro and Guaido on coming to this agreement, I think is something that we wouldn't have seen from the Trump administration. And just yesterday, Juan Gonzalez, who's senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council, said, Maduro should be talking not to us, but to Guaido. And his message to Guaido is not, his message to Maduro is not the US is going to lift sanctions, but his message to Guaido is, if you can agree on certain steps toward democratization, like one thing he mentioned was improving or creating a valid electoral council, which was a huge part of, say, Mexico's progress toward democratization, then we may change the sanctions regime in response to those kinds of measures. And I think that targeting this kind of incremental goal, like getting a real electoral council, is a big shift from Trump, where the demands were, now you resign, which was, a lot of bluster, but not very practical, and obviously didn't work. So I feel optimistic that Biden has a great team in place and realizes that Maduro is terrible for Venezuela and that everyone would like to see regime change. And that at the same time, he remains the de facto president. And what can we do about the humanitarian situation and moving toward democracy more incrementally?
Thanks, Dorothy. That was great, and I think it gives us a great transition to what I want to ask Armando, which is obviously the one political actor that has been out there in the fields dealing with the situation himself, because the opposition has been extremely divided about the way in which it should engage with Maduro, right? Some people. So first, I would like you to explain to those who are with us today that maybe don't follow the politics of Venezuela on a day-to-day, what is the scenario out there? Some opposition parties participated in the elections, the majority didn't, but now even those that didn't are like, some are willing to negotiate incrementally on small points. Some of them are like, we only want to like do a whole negotiation, maybe mediated by Norway or others. Why don't you paint a scenario of how is the opposition looking? And if I can ask you to use your incredible experience to be a little bit critical of like, what has been done wrong? How can things be improved in the future? How can we get the opposition to become a more effective actor, let's say, or interlocutor towards that kind of incremental change that Dorothy was describing? If you feel that that is actually the right option, because perhaps you don't.
Well, what could have done differently? Let's say, what could have the Tutsis have done differently in Rwanda? What could have, I don't know, Albanians and Bosnians could have done differently in Kosovo during the Balkan Wars? What could have the Armenians done differently before the genocide, or democratic forces in previous erosion to power of Hitler, you know? So this is, my point is that there's this geopolitical scenario which many people refuse to talk about, and it's this great power competition, and they're all there in Venezuela. All of the foes, all the Western or especially American foes are in Venezuela. Let's say Iran, Russia, China, and to a certain extent allies as well in NATO, like Turkey. And this is what I wanted to talk about: strategic corruption, which is the rise of strategic corruption was a work did by Selikov, Edelman, Christopher Harrison, and Celeste Ward on last year's foreign policy. And they signal not just bureaucratic and grand corruption, where they mention Venezuela among grand corruption. Let's remember that they stole over $400 billion. That's over 20 times the Marshall Plan, which was used to rebuild Europe after the Second World War. And they used the financial system, international financial system, to do this. So by the issuing of debt, that's what they did during 20 years. So that was, they turned the Venezuelan financial system into this huge money laundering machinery and schemes. So in bureaucratic and grand corruption, the payers, and I quote the authors are, and the payees are mainly just trying to get rich. By contrast, in strategic corruption, the greed still there for at least some of the players. Still, the corrupt indictments are wielded against a target country by foreigners as part of their own country national strategy. End of the quote. According to the authors, this is something that Russia, China, and Turkey have done. And by the way, all of those countries, as I mentioned, they have a foothold in Venezuela, using the country as a base of operation, trading illegal gold, and using the financial system. That's the reason why Venezuelan crisis is not a problem for the region, but a problem for democracy as a whole. So what with the Venezuelan opposition during 20 years, we could say that we had like three phases or three stages of the Venezuelan opposition. So the first one is you can name it as dispersed resistance. It was more on the defensive from 1999 to 2006, and after we participated in 2006 election, and for over a decade, we followed a strategy based on the accumulation. That's what they call it, the accumulation of forces to gain popular support by electoral organization and participation. And we learned in this time that when we managed to win in the electoral realm, the regime would strip the regime would strip out of competences the spaces of political power gained by the opposition, namely cities, governorships, and ultimately in 2015 the National Assembly. So since 2019, we decided to dispute, as Dorothy mentioned, in other words, the regime's legitimacy at all levels. So the Venezuelan Constitution taxatively in articles, in the Venezuelan Constitution, articles 333, 350, and some of the articles state that when there's a vacuum of power and nobody recognized nor the past elections or fake elections in past December, but also in 2018 elections, presidential election. This is why Guaido was appointed by the National Assembly as the interim president. It's because the Constitution states this. So this strategy is based on the building of capacities to exercise power progressively as the best alternative to violence. And this means to control the funds, to being recognized, to be able to sign international agreements, and so on and so forth. So and here's something I would like to stress now, and this is very important. We have embraced, during the last 2 decades, we have embraced nonviolence as our way of political struggle. And by doing so, we can claim the moral ground, of course, but has this been sufficient? And I don't have an answer to that. So What I do know is that in terms of real politics, everybody can agree that until now, it has been in strategic liability, in the sense that, I mean, because of their willingness, I mean, the regime willingness to murder, torture, imprison political dissent, using food as a weapon, and also the weaponization of social media, fuel conflict and migration. The regime and its allies have a strategic superiority over democratic forces, and this is reality, because our unwillingness to recur to violent practices. So the first thing we need to acknowledge is that we are in the midst of a war against democracy, and Venezuela is just a country where the enemies of democracies tested or have been testing their weapons in this new type of warfare. What we're doing right now is just resist, continue the struggle to be true to ourselves and to our principles, and trying to innovate, as Javier also, we try to innovate in a democratic way. So this strategy that challenge the legitimacy of the dictatorship, and put the National Assembly at the forefront of this struggle, and it's something that it cannot, to my mind, maybe I'm wrong, but it was not a Trump administration strategy, and it's not failed, by the way. I think strategies are long. You can see strategies being advancing through time. So in this new type of let's say warfare or struggle for democracy, we started a new phase in 2019. Let's remember that it was the Obama administration that, with an executive order, that portrayed the Venezuelan regime as a threat to security. So I think the Trump administration, and what Biden is doing and is going to do, it's just part of a bipartisan consensus and a national security strategy towards Venezuela, and we need to help on the adapting of that strategy.
Thanks, Armando. I'm sure there's a lot of there can be a lot of debate about what you've just said, and I'm sure in the Q&A there hopefully we'll have a chance for that. I want to turn to Mike as the last question, and remind our audience that you can either raise your hand and I'll give you the floor after he finishes, or you can ask your question in the Q&A and I'll read it aloud. But before we finish with the more formal part of the conversation, I wanted to ask Mike to maybe look at this geopolitical angle that we just started having this conversation about, with the role of the US, in particular because Maduro has had the support of China and Russia, which really has prevented much of this moving in the Security Council at the UN. The OAS has sort of been marginalized of the conversation, perhaps because the government refuses to really engage with them. And Maduro has a very close relationship with Cuba, but terrible relations with its neighbors, in particular with Colombia and Guyana. You might have seen the response this morning from the Foreign Ministry to the request that Arreaza did yesterday to have the UN intervene on what's happening in Apure right now. So clearly the tensions there are not going to diminish. How have geopolitics affected this crisis in Venezuela? And simultaneously, how has the crisis really affected Latin America overall, Mike?
I think that's a really important question. And I think that this, it's important to recognize that, like every country, Venezuela lives in a neighborhood that's nested within, the world of great power politics. And both of those dimensions have important impacts on the current situation. So if we think about broader geopolitics and how that has impacted Venezuela, I would say that it's done so in many ways. Here are a few, right? First, let's think about Russia and China. So Russia and China have done business deals in Venezuela and floated the government of Venezuela loans in order to help keep Maduro afloat. The country, as Dorothy previously mentioned, otherwise has difficulty accessing international financial markets. And so in that particular environment, Russia and China have really stepped up, and they've done so to sort of, poke a finger in the eye of the United States, I think. So there are strategic reasons why they're doing that. There are economic reasons as well, but really, I think there's a broader geopolitical background to it. In terms of Cuba, for a very long time, Venezuela has shipped Cuba oil, heavily subsidized, or in some cases basically free oil in exchange for Cuba giving Venezuela assistance in other ways. And so, for example, Cuba has exported a lot of doctors to Venezuela, right? So they send doctors to Venezuela to work throughout the country, really, in the healthcare system. They've also sent intelligence personnel, right, into Venezuela as well, to work with the government and to help, help train the government on things tied to intelligence and tied to the military and to paramilitaries. There have been good reports on a lot of this and the effects of a lot of this within the country, right? So, for example, there are interesting reports from some of these Cuban doctors about how they've been instructed to basically withhold services from individuals who don't indicate that they'll vote for the Maduro government, and so and that they've also helped to try and turn out the vote. So, clearly there's a geopolitical dimension here. And again, Cuba is really pretty deeply involved in Venezuela. But it's also important to think about the United States as well, right? Beyond, Russia, China, Cuba, the United States is also a major player here. From my perspective, I think, Trump sort of, walked his talk on America first. I think that he certainly rattled his saber on Venezuela, and as Dorothy mentioned, he ratcheted up sanctions, and this is as Armando mentioned, I think this is basically a continuing sort of bipartisan strategy to put pressure on the Maduro government. But I think in other ways, Trump was a little bit less diligent or a little bit less, concerned about the actual outcomes in the end, right? So it seems like, the U.S. tried to arrange meetings with elements of the military in order to try and seek defections, for example, but it seemed like the way in which those meetings were set up was sort of bungled. It's not clear exactly how far the U.S. really wanted to go and what it was willing to do and invest in at the time. So I think there's a little bit of, it's not entirely clear how much, I guess I would say in some, the Trump regime really cared about regime change per se. Although what I will say is, again, going back to the kind of America First theme, there have been, and I'll talk more about this in just a minute, the number of immigrants from Venezuela, refugees fleeing the country, has grown astronomically in recent years. There's now over 5 million Venezuelans that have fled the country. And those people go all over the Americas and beyond, but many of them ended up many of them go to Florida, right? Many of them end up in Miami. And it turns out that that's really useful politically, right? So, I think, a lot of the, the threats that Trump levied against Maduro were very effective in cultivating the Venezuelan vote in Florida and actually in turning Florida for Trump in this last election. So I think that was one very clear payoff from some of the policies, but the other ones I think are much less clear in terms of the actual consequences. Okay, what about more closer to Venezuela? What about Latin America and Venezuela's immediate neighbors and the geopolitics there? Well, the neighbors to Venezuela are really bearing a pretty substantial burden. Obviously, nothing like the Venezuelan people themselves, but nonetheless, there's definitely a geopolitical story outside of Venezuela's borders within Latin America. One good example of this is Colombia, right, which is taking in millions of migrants in Venezuela, and most recently, granting citizenship to people, offering citizenship, which is or granting people an ability to stay in the country for up to 10 years, I should say. That's really an incredible show of support for the broader for Venezuelan people, I think, considering the crisis. There's also a more difficult relationship with Colombia in the sense that, Venezuela has provided cross-border support for armed groups, as well as collaboration with drug traffickers. That's also really pretty well documented. Other countries in the region beyond Colombia are also taking in substantial numbers of migrants, and that's affecting, politics in other countries as well. So, places like Peru and Ecuador are also taking in really large numbers of migrants, and it's changing the political landscape in those countries. Surprisingly, a final note, I would say, surprisingly, in some ways, when you think about it from a historical perspective, the region is really quite united against Maduro in a way that's unusual. Obviously, Latin American countries are quite wary about intervention within the region, especially from the United States, given the history of that. But I would say at this particular moment, it's really quite impressive how united the region is against Maduro, and I think that presents an opportunity for leverage, certainly.
Thanks, Mike, very much. And I think there's going to be a good chance to have a conversation about what it means, the opposition to Maduro, but through which political strategy. But before we go into that, so I have Diego Loyo first on my list of people who wanted to intervene. If Diego, if you want to turn on your camera, then we can give you the floor.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Renata, and thank you, everybody. All the panelists have been very full from very different perspectives. My name is Diego Loyo. I'm actually AB 17 from the university, and I am a Venezuelan citizen currently living in Caracas after a long while. I had a couple of questions. I'm not going to go through all of them because I'm sure there are many, but I did have a very specific question regarding the differences between the objectives that the international community may have with regards to the Venezuelan democratization and the objective of the regime, which is to basically stay in power. So there's no doubt that with democratization, a lot of the people inside the regime would have to give up a lot of the privileges and a lot of the securities that they currently have, not only the people that are involved in drug trafficking, but also the people that are involved with all the accounts of corruption, etc. So how, this might be addressed specifically to Professor Kronick, but it might be answered by any of the panelists. How do you actually create a leverage, a strategy that makes democratization easier in Venezuela, when you already know that the ultimate goal from most people in power here in Venezuela is to actually never leave power and stay secure behind the power that they have?
Thanks, Diego. And I think that question is actually quite connected with a lot of the questions that we're getting on the chat, which is essentially about strategy, right? And how do you both precisely that give Maduro enough carrots that he will be willing to cede some of the power, or at least align an electoral council that will be allowing the possibility for him to lose and leave power, and what would be the strategy from the opposition that actually works and is effective in getting us there. So perhaps I'm going to read two questions and then I'll turn it out to the panel, and you guys can all chip in on how you see these issues. So one particular one is about the non-material effects of the sanctions, right? And that would be the stigmatization that comes with sanctions. Do you think that they matter in terms of support that the regime receives from foreign publics that could potentially translate into new foreign governments' willingness to support the regime? And if this stigmatization might matter, does it matter from whom? From the rich and powerful Western countries like the US, or neighboring countries for Latin America? So what is sort of the non-material implication of these sanctions? And then I guess we have a couple of comments and questions regarding, I think probably Armando's intervention on what is the right strategy, right? And how we think about the opposition as an actor that moves the needle in where we are. And one consideration seems to be the kind of stability that perhaps this is not me saying it. Freya Rocha is suggesting that perhaps other countries are easing on the pressure on Venezuela because they might have been finding some kind of a stability that they seem to be living with. They will be okay living with this stability. And if perhaps it's not that the strategy failed, but rather that the international community is sort of throwing their hands up in the air that nothing can be done. I can tell you that that's probably not the case from Colombia, who, as Javier was and Mike were pointing out, is receiving thousands of Venezuelans daily. But we have issues such as Argentina living in the Lima group, which means that even though there is an opposition to Maduro, there is clearly some big discrepancies on what are the proper strategies to actually get the situation changed in Venezuela. So Diego's question and those two, maybe Dorothy, do you want to start and then we'll go around?
Sure, great. Thanks for these great questions, Diego, and everyone who added questions to the chat. I mean, what is the best strategy going forward to move toward democratization in Venezuela? That is obviously the most important question in a lot of ways. And I want to start by acknowledging that I don't know. If I knew the answer to that question, maybe I would be on the National Security Council or Deputy Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs. That said, let me offer just some thoughts, right? So what is the logic of the maximum pressure strategy that was the focus of Trump's policy? And that, to Gino's question in the chat, is also the idea behind targeted sanctions. So not these economic sanctions, but targeted sanctions on individuals. I think the idea in some ways is to make the status quo very costly for members of the regime. And I don't think the strategy has worked. I don't think it's the right strategy to pursue going forward, but it's important to understand what the logic is, because of course there is a logic, I think, which is that, if you make staying in power very costly and perhaps try to make leaving power less costly with the carrots that Renata was alluding to, then you may get defections, you may get people in the military to defect, you may get the regime to splinter, and that could be productive. So I think there is a logic to that. I think it hasn't worked, and I wouldn't expect it to work, in part because just as these sanctions make the status quo more costly for members of the regime, which they certainly do, they also risk making a transition more costly, right? I mean, as you empower kind of people in the opposition who might want to institute a truth commission and hold these people accountable for crimes and perhaps extradite them and have them tried for drug trafficking and all of that, which I completely understand. I mean, there obviously have been horrific crimes committed under the Maduro administration. One thing that I'm not sure has been explicitly mentioned in this panel that I think we shouldn't lose sight of is the massive number of extrajudicial killings. This is the kind of one of the highest level of state violence basically we've seen in the region since the Cold War. Okay, and so this is terrible. At the same time, I think if we look at examples of transitions to democracy in Latin America, this strategy of kind of maximum prosecution and persecution of the regime once they get out of power has not been the most successful. And so if you look at, one thing I think we can learn from is in Mexico in the 1990s, there was a big focus on getting a credible electoral council. Okay, and I understand why that as a demand from Washington or from the Venezuelan opposition doesn't feel satisfying, because the demand that we want to make is Maduro leave power now. First you resign, then we'll deal with everything else. And I understand that, but that hasn't proved very practical. And I wonder whether these kind of more incremental demands of let's get a credible electoral council so that we can move toward elections in a few years might be a more productive strategy. And I think there are other examples from the region that show that some really painful and unsavory kind of concessions to members of a horrific murderous regime like that of Maduro have helped a transition to democracy, for example, in Chile, right? I mean, what happened to Pinochet? I mean, he remained part of the government after he was out of power, head of the military. I mean, he retained tremendous power. And so I certainly, on the one hand, how could we let Maduro or any of these people continue to have any role in a government? And how can we give them, any amnesty? And at the same time, I worry that this maximum pressure strategy, while it makes the status quo worse, also makes it very difficult for the opposition to credibly commit to any sort of, post-transition livable life for people in the military and in the current regime as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Dorothy. I see Armando's like shaking his head. But I'm gonna allow Javier to maybe you want to go first, Javier, or should we go to Armando and then you can respond to him? Let's go with Armando, and then we'll go to you, Armando.
Oh yeah, I couldn't open the microphone. So according with I don't think there's just sanctions that make the living or the ousting of power costly for the Maduro regime. It's just the international legal order. So Venezuela is a subscriber of the Rome Treaty for the creation of the International Criminal Court. Not the United States, Venezuela is. So there's no room to hide for human or for crimes against humanity perpetrators. And Maduro knows it. And he's being accused of crimes against humanity according to UN reports, right? While we're speaking, there are over 300 political prisoners in Venezuela, and there have been like horrific crimes committed according. So drawing from the example of Chile, let us remember that the transition was just before the end or the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there was all of this type of adjustments playing in the world, not just in Chile, also in Panama and all over Latin America, but also in the Philippines and so on and so forth. So I think to some extent, the United States facilitated in a diplomatic way or some other ways this wave of democracy, even in countries that were their allies in the geopolitical spectrum. So let us remember this because it's inconceivable having a perpetrator of crimes against humanity being part of a future democratic or transitional government in Venezuela. And again, Maduro knows it. And this is not because I'm saying it or is a request of the United States. It's just because it's what the international law states. And if we are arguing for an international rules-based society, we have to comply to those obligations, and we have to be, consistent to those principles. So yes, so this is the conundrum, I think, in this situation. It's not that the maximum pressure has failed. It's that we need more pressure and more coordinated pressure, especially from our European allies. So, there's huge amounts of vested interests for money laundering and financial obscure schemes playing all over Europe. So for example, according to Transparency Venezuela, there are lawsuits for over $35 billion in more than 50 countries around the world. So the failure of the Venezuelan democracy becoming what, again, Alberto Reyes stated as a liquid totalitarianism. And by the way, we know what totalitarianisms aim at their core, which is expansionism. So in the era of globalization, where there's influx of information and flows of people through migration and flows of information and money, they leverage. So the strategy of the regime and their allies leverage on that to cling into power, to remain into power, and to attack and to have. So like in basketball, their best defense is their offense play. So that's what they're doing. That's what they always go and jump in to be more radical. So that's how they play.
Oh, I guess Renata's muted, but I was just going to, may I ask a question to Armando? Okay, yeah, so Armando, I guess I hope that no one here would question the severity, the gravity of the crimes of the Maduro administration, and certainly not me. As you said, my research has been focused on state violence, police violence, and it's truly horrific. So I think that's not an issue. My question is, over the last 4 years, this strategy of continually ratcheting up sanctions, of trying to get the international community, Lima Group, the rest of the region, Europe on board, and quite successfully in some cases imposing, for example, with Rosneft, making it very costly for actors outside the United States to funnel money to the Venezuelan regime. This strategy has not worked in the sense Maduro is still in power, and we don't see, political change often takes us by surprise, right? But we don't see right now a lot of signs of Maduro leaving power very soon. And so my question is, what would you expect to change in terms of how this strategy works? Like going forward, especially with, as someone mentioned in the chat, other countries, for better or worse, maybe taking a more practical approach and engaging with Maduro in various ways, as with the COVAX agreement that I mentioned earlier. What could we expect to change to make this strategy the answer to Diego's question about how should we go forward?
Thanks, Dorothy. We have only 5 minutes left. Obviously, this is one conversation gets the best always is like right before we finish. So I'm going to turn to Mike and Javier. So I'm sure that they get a word in, and then Armando might have the last word only in this panel, not in live.
Javier, did you want to go first, since I know that you were in the lineup before? Or?
I don't want to address exactly what we're talking about now, but Michael, if you want to, go ahead, please.
So maybe I'll jump in on this point really quick. I think this is a really tough thing. I do a lot of work on democratic transitions and how to, I've read a lot about how transitions sort of transpire and kind of what are the possibilities that are on the table. And I think in the Venezuelan case, it's really complicated. I think, you have to be careful about not taking a maximalist position in the sense of, I think, having an opposition try and prosecute everything in the regime if you're going to try and set up a negotiated settlement. That being said, I think there are some crimes, as Armando, I think, has pointed out and is alluding to here, with human rights violations and everything by the Maduro regime, that are simply beyond the pale. And I don't think you can include some of these members of the regime anymore. I think a few years ago, you might have been able to craft a deal to put Maduro into some agency somewhere and have him in some middling position and protect him for at least some period of time from prosecution, and bring in more moderate members of the regime along into a post-transition settlement. But I think that time has probably passed. And so I think at this point, that is, of course, I think Armando is also right. Maduro knows that, and I think the regime knows that, and that is causing them to dig their heels in. And so, we in those circumstances, you might think about other things like, although also unsavory, perhaps a golden parachute, to Russia, to Cuba, et cetera. Send some of these guys out of the country, where perhaps for a short period of time they can, avoid prosecution, but that they will have warrants out for their arrest if they decide to leave anywhere, right? To leave the places that are hosting them. And then again, to bring in the opposition, try and bring some number of people from the regime that are untarnished to a much greater degree in order to craft a negotiated settlement. I think that's probably the only way you get something like a negotiated settlement right now. The alternative is the regime is to try and sweep the regime out through something like this maximum pressure strategy. That has very high stakes for the regime, and of course they're going to push back very hard as they've done. But it of course has high stakes for the opposition as well. So it's a very difficult time, I think, for trying to figure out how to negotiate an actual transition differently from trying to force a transition.
Thanks, Mike. We're running almost on time, but we are going to extend for 5 more minutes. Obviously, we understand that some people have to drop off. I'm going to turn to Javier and Armando, and maybe this will convince Kevin to invite us over again soon so we can keep on having this conversation that obviously still has much more to be discussed. Javier.
Let me take 2 minutes and address an aspect of Trump's policy that we haven't discussed, and I think also was misguided. The Trump administration launched, together with its policy toward Venezuela, a strange policy toward China and Russia. The policy toward China was antagonize China all the way. The policy toward Russia was Trump was the Russian ambassador in Washington, D.C. Because of this, Russia's presence in Venezuela expanded significantly under Trump. And in many ways, we need to imagine what the policy would have been like if the approaches would have been different under Trump, if we had encouraged China to be more pragmatic about Venezuela and perhaps recognize its losses there and maybe convince some groups in Venezuela that it would have been nice to perhaps think of a change of guard. We didn't do that, and we actually turned China deeper into a more antagonistic view toward the United States and to exhibit that game in Venezuela. And then we, let me not say more about Russia, but that was a very misguided part on the, and in fact, Mike Pompeo and the staff were very aware of the contradiction at the White House. So one of the problems of criticizing the policy toward Venezuela is that there was maximum pressure towards Maduro, but a very soft approach towards Russia. And maybe there was a huge mistake there.
Thank you, Javier. Yeah, and I think that the repercussions of that we're seeing in many other angles besides Venezuela too. Okay, Armando, you have the privilege of the last word today.
No, it's been a privilege for me actually being here in this panel. So going back to what Dorothy said, she at some point she argued that it was a huge mismanagement on behalf of the regime, and I think you have to analyze the objective. Like for them, if their objective was not to bring development about, it was just to remain in power, hyperinflation, for example, and this is just a hypothesis, might have been something that they aimed for. Like Zimbabwe at some point in Myanmar, we're seeing like regimes cling into power while they're trying to, in Nicaragua at some point they have like the long-standing hyperinflation, and this helped at some point Ortega, you know what I mean? So we have to acknowledge on that part. What I think the way forward is to ask for more unity at the international level, for more strategic cooperation, especially on behalf of the allies. There's a recent article by my good friend Jose Ramon Morales from the Harvard Growth Lab and Professor Ricardo Hausman, stating that maybe with a conditional cash transfer policy, as with Héroes de la Salud, heroes from health, on behalf of the interim government, and for example, the issuing of passports that can be done because Guaido's represent the legitimate government, and he could issue passports, is a way of keep on fighting and to contest in a non-violent way again the regime power. There's no easy solution, as all the panelists can agree, and especially if we are assuming that our struggle is a non-violent at its core. You know what I mean? So so in this sense, like it's quite challenging, and we have to be very creative and perseverant, and we are willing to do so. I just tweeted after they released the report of the digital autocracies resembling Churchill's. What to do now? It's we shall fight. When he said we shall fight on the streets, we shall fight on the hills, we shall fight on Twitter, we shall fight on YouTube, and we shall fight on TikTok, and we shall fight on this obscure internet, and we shall never surrender. So this is my message. Until we get freedom and democracy, we're willing to do what we have to do in order to free our country and to bring development and for people have to regain happiness. This is what we need in Venezuela, you know, to reunite a family, to bring together 5 million people if they want to back to their country. This is what we want. Thank you.
Thanks, Armando. I mean, I think obviously there's a lot of opinions of how we should get there, but there's definitely, I think, a consensus, at least among everybody here today, that is the goal, that we're all hoping that Venezuela really sees some better days, not too far ahead, and hopefully we can all try and work together towards that. With that, we close, being very grateful for the generosity of everybody's time and allowing us to extend a little bit. Thank you so much to University of Chicago for hosting us today, and everybody. I apologize for those of you who wanted to intervene and time was short, but hopefully we will have a good opportunity. And I'm sure my colleagues and I are obviously always very happy to have a conversation individually. You can reach us through email and Twitter and all those obscure sites of the internet that Armando was just mentioning. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good afternoon and a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Renata. Thank you, Kevin.